Yeah, there's been loads of questions and loads of chat. If the panel have their video buttons to hand, then it might be nice to see some faces. I can see Esther. That's nice. So yeah, I picked out a few questions, and hopefully we have a little bit of time to work through them. So a few people have asked us about what we know so far about modal shift, and Esther, actually, it was really nice to have that as our last talk, because with Barcelona being slightly ahead of us in using e-scooters, it's good to see a bit more data. But maybe to our panel in general, what do we know about the type of modal shift that's going on? And if we're not that sure yet, how do we intend to assess what modal shift is happening?
I can probably kick off with that, and then I'll hand over to Graham.
Yeah, go ahead.
There was some stated preference pieces in the research. It's been tricky to measure given the environment we've been working in. So, particularly in the Salford scheme, with that kicking off in October, and then the subsequent lockdowns and the very limited extent of the scheme up until fairly recently, it's difficult to get any real modal shift data from that. And if you do get it, it's not particularly reliable just because the data set is so limited. Having said that, since we've opened up in April, obviously usage has increased significantly. So we're doing around 3,500 trips minimum per week now, which is giving us a bit better insight. So what we do get from Lime is we can identify, we term them as either cyclical or utility trips. So your cyclical trips are typically going from a virtual dock either back to that same dock or back to a dock that's very close to it, and then the utility trips are more your A to B trips. And to an extent, we can infer that that's a utility journey rather than just being used for leisure. So that's one way we assess how they're actually being used in terms of real trips, I guess. For modal shift, it tends to be more asking users how their journeys otherwise would have been made. So I think Graham may have done some research on that, but at the moment there is some work with DFT and it's being built into the Lime app that we will start questioning users basically at the end of their trip how that journey might otherwise have been made, built into the app. So that's how we're going to start gathering data on that, and hopefully over the next 6 months or so, as things slowly, touch wood, start getting back to normal, we'll have some more interesting pieces to report on that.
Brilliant, thank you. Yeah. Does anyone else on the panel want to kind of add any thoughts on modal shift, what we know or how we learn about it?
Yeah, I'll add to that then. And by the way, earlier on, I think I forgot to mention that our research is funded by TFGEM and Lime. So I don't know where my manners were, but yeah, we obviously want to acknowledge that funding. Yeah, in our research so far, what we've done is ask people how they see themselves using e-scooters or how they have used e-scooters. So we've asked them to think about the modes they could use instead of or in combination with. So we'll get a good idea of that from the people we've worked with, spoken to, and they also give us some kind of more qualitative information about why they may or may not, for example, combine it with a bike journey or another mode. What we'll tend to have is a per person rather than per journey. So we'll know, for example, how many people combine e-scooters with buses rather than how many journeys have been made by e-scooter and bus, just because of the type of methodology that we're using. We're not really asking people per journey, but it sounds like from what Connor said that Lime will get some of that data, which will be really interesting. And then maybe to bring those two data sets together would be really useful.
Yeah,
that's just reminded me as well, in terms of data we can infer on intermodality. Again, because we get all the data at a trip-by-trip level for each dock, we can see if there's, say, a hotspot at one of the train stations. So Salford Crescent, for example, the docks around there are getting fairly significant use, as is a dock that's near Salford Central. So that is giving us some early indication, at least, that the scheme is potentially being used for that first and last mile piece to then access public transport.
Yeah, that's picking up on one of the comments actually about whether we're looking at where the activity is happening and inferring from that. Stations would be a very likely indication of first and last mile. I thought I'd nudge us on to some of the questions about inclusivity, because a lot of people in the chat were kind of thinking about that, and we've heard a bit from some of our speakers. I'm wondering if the panel generally, we touched on bits, but I thought it might be nice to speak a bit more about whether we think there are kind of specific or fundamental conflicts between certain users and ways that we might overcome them, or if there were just kind of inherent problems with different users and infrastructures, and how these things might all come together. I'm wondering, Esther, given that Barcelona has more experience with some of this, that sort of the interactions between different user groups, how is that being experienced on the streets in Barcelona, and those perceptions of safety you mentioned, things like that?
Yeah. So to start with, perception of safety from e-scooter drivers is quite interesting, because people didn't hesitate to use high-speed scooters when their speed was not still capped. It has been capped to 25 kilometers per hour, but there were some of these devices who could reach more than 40 kilometers per hour, and they were using them. But then when we see the helmet use is higher in e-scooter riders, even if it's not compulsory, than in cyclists. So that might mean, hey, wait a minute, maybe I'm exposing a little bit more myself if I use a scooter, so maybe I can use a helmet and then run anyway. You know, so I think speed is a very interesting issue here, and is a very technical issue as well when we think about how these two type of vehicles are sharing cycle lanes, for example, and they need to overcome cyclists all the time. And when they are placing themselves in front, like at the beginning of the cycle lane in the traffic lights, to be the first ones to run, this is a very different behavior from what we are used to seeing in cyclists. So even if their kind of average speed is the same, so for example, when I'm sharing cycle lane with the e-scooter, in the long fragments of the cycle lane, I might be having the same speed as they have. But the difference is this overcoming when I'm starting to stop, or when I'm about to, start again after a traffic light. So these moments are, I think, very critical moments. And in Barcelona, what is this? This is raising a very important issue with the width of the cycle lanes. They were already very narrow. Even bi-directional cycle lanes are very narrow. So this is finally raising the question of, should we widen the cycle lane? So this is something that finally is putting this on the table, which is going to, I hope, also provide more space for cargo bikes, no conventional cycles, and hopefully this will help with that, to be honest. So there's always pros and cons.
Yeah, that's a really interesting thought, that debate about widening the cycle lanes triggered by e-scooters may have knock-on positive effects for, like you say, adapted cycles or cargo bikes. Antonio, I wondered if you could tell us a bit more about whether, because there's an interesting chat about the use of bells to alert people, and I wondered if you could tell us a bit more about the acoustic vehicle alerting stuff, and whether there are some other examples of smaller vehicles that do manage to use these successfully in practice.
Yeah, I mean, regarding your first question, I think I just replied to that in the chat. The problem with bells is that you don't have the sense of the direction of the vehicle is coming from, because of the characteristics of that sound. Basically, you hear that, but you don't know whether the vehicle is coming from behind or laterally or whatever. The other thing to say about that is you don't have a feeling of how the vehicle is approaching, because that's just a bell, so you don't have any connection with the speed of the vehicle. And the last thing to say is we need to understand that the noticeability is going to be significantly different in an open place or in a busy road, and especially when we have people relying on acoustic cues as blind or partially sighted people, that might be an issue. So let's think on the case of a busy road. Is the bell enough information from an acoustic point of view, enough information in order to hear the vehicle, notice the vehicle, understanding where the vehicle is coming from, and all of that. that's the main motivation. There might be other cases, simple cases, when basically you can have just bell, but I don't think the bell will work for the majority of the cases, typical cases in an urban environment. Yeah, and regarding your second question, again, I think the only thing here is, and we don't really understand, is how the vehicles will be operating. I mean, compared to bicycles, and because it's going to be a new vehicle, there might be some time to accommodate and to understand. I mean, even for us pedestrians as well. Yeah,
yeah, brilliant. Thank you. The Healthy Active Cities team crowd, 20 seconds of thoughts on vulnerable users and possible conflicts with e-scooters.
I think going back to what I sort of alluded to earlier, and what Antonio and Esther has also just sort of touched on as well, is that it's really complex. There's a multitude of factors taking place in regards to the interactions within these spaces. As I was saying, the sort of early days of our research is showing that we've got people who may feel confident on the scooters, but also may feel unconfident on the scooters. And you've got people who might feel confident on the pavements, not confident on the pavements, particularly shared spaces where these sort of pedestrians and e-scooters may interact. But then also go into sort of the user angle as well. What Esther mentioned, I thought was really interesting about how a lot of people who are scooting may not be able to take their hand off the handlebars to either signal or even just make their presence known in some other way, and so they're very limited to they're sort of stuck on the vehicle, which again potentially comes with its drawbacks for alerting and communicating with other people using these spaces. So that's given me some ideas to take forward into the next sort of tranche of our research over the next few months, for sure.
I think it's interesting that connects with what Harry was saying with discussion with the reference group. You know, it's very complicated with the kind of relationship with cars and which the bigger problem, or how you balance the fact that it's not as straightforward as we might like to think. I think we better call it there. We had loads of really interesting questions. I was going to ask about where we go from here and the language of e-scooters and riders and drivers and all that stuff, but we have run out of time. So I'll just thank our speakers, and I'll give them a round of applause.
Thank you.
And we'll be publishing a report that kind of summarizes some of this on our website, so look out for that. I've posted a link, which I guess I could post again. Please sign up to our final next seminar on low traffic neighborhoods. There we go. Excellent. And thank you again to everyone who's participated and asked questions, and to our speakers who have not only listened and answered questions, but also typed their responses to some of the questions in the chat, as is the sort of double attention span that we need for these online webinars. So yeah, thank you everybody, and I'll look forward to seeing everyone next time.
Thank you, Sam. Thanks everyone.
Yeah, thanks, Sam, and thanks everyone for coming.
Thanks everyone, and those reports are going to be really interesting as well, I think.
Yeah.